Nick Angstadt from Locked On NBA here, and I am now sitting down with Brad Rowland, the great writer and podcaster from Locked On Hawks. Hawks are in the playoffs. Hawks are a fifth seed in the playoffs facing the Knicks. We know that now, but let's get into what the Hawks are and some of the changes from this team as opposed to some of the teams in the past. Who's in the playoff rotation, Brad? And then who are some of the role players that are really going to stand out and have to step up for them to win this first round series?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I feel like the playoff rotation is very uncertain because they haven't been healthy all year. I've made the joke already on my podcast that game one of the playoff series will be the healthiest they've been this season, which is not the way it usually works.
The true
It's
for a lot of
usually the
teams,
opposite.
though, actually.
Yeah, I guess that's true, but it's usually the opposite. Like you're kind of banged up by then, but they had this break and Governor Hunter's back. Anyway, I think there's 7 or 8 locks. It's the high profile guys. You have your Trae Young, DeAndre Hunter, Bogdanovich, Clint Capela, John Collins, Kevin Huerter. I think those guys are pretty much the locks that you would see. Danilo Gallinari, I think, is close to lock status based on basically only if he's not playing defense can they not take him out to have him on the court. And then from there, you get into some uncertainty. I think Lou Williams is the backup point guard for sure, but he might get played off the floor. There's a question about his defense for sure. And then you have these supporting guys, like you have the first round pick and Onyeka Okongwu, who is a backup center. If they play a backup center, he'll be it. But they may not. They have John Collins to do that if they wanted to go small. And then they have a couple of veteran, like plug and play types like Solomon Hill and Tony Snell. So I think it's going to be 8 to 10 guys. Nate McMillan has been very mum. He does not like to share a lot of information, which is, I appreciate that, but also don't appreciate that at the same time. I'd love to know what's going on, but I also get why he wouldn't. So I feel good about 8 guys. And then beyond that, it's kind of guess and check right now.
Interesting. Has anybody stepped up as a fan favorite this season that maybe you didn't expect? I mean, we know that people love Trae Young and all that, but has anyone really emerged as fans really love this guy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the big guys are the fan favorites for the most part. I think Tony Snell has kind of a cult following right now.
50, 100.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he basically just didn't miss a shot for 3 months, which is funny. The volume's low, all that stuff. But I think he's probably the closest thing in terms of one of those under the radar. Not a prominent name, and it's been kind of a joke at times across the league. But he's actually been quite good this year, honestly, and they've needed him pretty badly. So I'll go with Tony Snell.
He's like the Boban of your team almost. He's not necessarily bad. He's kind of good at times, but it's you have to give him.
He can play. He's totally fine. He's just also not the most impressive. But if you shoot 55% from 3 for the season, you're in pretty good shape.
So what does this Hawks team do well? What do they really excel at? And then what do they really struggle with? What are you expecting from this team going into the playoffs? And what have they shown you so far this regular season?
I think obviously they're an offense first team. They were built to be an offense first team. We'll talk about Clint Capela in a second, but with Trae Young, Trey drives an offense. I mean, even when they were bad last year, when he was on the court, they were good offensively. And basically, without fail, when he plays, they're really good. They get to the line a ton. Again, that goes to Trae Young. He's number 2 in the league, I think, in free throw attempts for the season. So they're number 2 or 3 in the league in overall attempts from the free throw line. And they have a bunch of shooting. So that combination, you would think translates well to the playoffs. One of the questions about this team is that they don't have a ton of experience, but the pieces fit so well that if you surround Trae Young with shooting and at least one lob threat, you're going to be in good shape. And the Knicks are really good defensively, but the Hawks should be able to do what they kind of do offensively. And then on the defensive end, I would call it a strength when Clint Capela plays. Now that's the big line of demarcation, because if you look at their numbers just in a vacuum, they're not that good. They're middling, maybe a little bit below average. But when Capela plays, they're basically a top 5 defense in the league. And when he's off the court, they're a bottom 5 defense in the league. So you would think he'll play more in the playoffs, but also you get a situation where it's almost a weakness at times too, because if you have Trae Young on the court, you have Lou Williams on the court, you have Gallinari on the court, those guys will get picked on in a playoff series. So it's kind of a combination. It's a strength when Capela plays, but it's also a potential point of weakness. And also, guarding Julius Randle in this series is a big question / potential weakness, because they got torched by Randle in the regular season. It's 3 games, but they don't have a perfect guy to throw on him either. So if you're looking for a point of potential concern, that might be one.
Interesting. What does this team win profile look like at this point? What are some of the biggest wins that you've seen from the Hawks this season? And then what are some of the worst losses or maybe the lowest moments of this Hawks season? Because there's been a couple of low moments, but we've also recently they've gone on a tear, right? They have the best record in the Eastern Conference recently.
Yeah, that's basically what the line is. I mean, they had a bunch of frustrating fourth quarter losses, mostly in the first half of the season under Lloyd Pierce. And there was this whole debate about whose fault that was, whether it's Pierce or whoever, but he got shown the door midseason. And basically ever since then, they've been incredible, to your point. Like they're either tied for first or maybe even first in the East since then, 27-11 under McMillan. So there haven't been a whole lot of low points recently. They had a couple of flops in the last couple of weeks on the road on like back-to-backs where they just kind of didn't show up. But they've won 11 in a row at home. They have the active longest winning streak in the league in their own building. They're 18-2 in the last 20 in their home building. So mostly it's a positive story under McMillan. Like they have a bunch of highs. Like they throttled the Suns. That was probably their best win of the season. They beat them by 30 points a couple weeks ago. And the Suns won a back-to-back on that stuff, but they played their real guys and they really kind of blew them out of the water. So I think Hawks fans are trying to forget the bad losses because it was kind of in a previous era when they had a different coach and a bunch of injuries. So I would say focus mostly is on that 27-11 run, and how real that is, we'll see, but they've been awesome for 3 months now.
Does any moment stand out as the lowest moment? Like after this game, it was just the most toxic on Hawks Twitter, or it's just like one of the worst feelings in a locker room or whatever?
There were a couple. I think there was, I'm not even sure it was a game, but there was a moment early in the season when there was some reporting about John Collins and Trae Young not getting along in a film session. And it was probably overblown by all accounts, but that kind of caused a stir, as you might imagine, when your two most prominent guys are not getting along. And then they had a couple of bad losses. And
as someone that covers the Dallas Mavericks, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That
so
same thing happened.
I think that might have been the one in terms of like fan angst, either that or a couple of those fourth quarter losses. In fact, the one that probably got Pierce fired in early March, late February. There were just a couple in a row where they just had no business losing, and they kind of gave games win the fourth quarter. And it's hard to pinpoint one, which kind of tells you the story. There were more than one. But I think when you have to change your coach midseason in a season where you're trying to win, that's probably a low point, but ended up going so well after that it ends up kind of being a nice pivot in retrospect.
Yeah, that kind of worked out in the end, and did not work out for the Pacers, by the way, who got rid of McMillan.
Not so much.
Yeah, now it's gone the opposite way. What are the stakes for this team going into the playoffs? I mean, is a first round win, like if they beat the Knicks, is that just gravy? It's just icing on the cake. The Hawks are just kind of happy to be here. Or if they lose in the first round, is there some real consequences? I mean, they've already changed the coach. I mean, the players are kind of the players. They've signed a couple of these guys long term. John Collins is the one guy that's sort of in flux still as to whether what's going to happen to him or not. But could we see some big whole scale changes if they lose? And is there anything that happens if they win?
I think for the most part, being the 5 seed, making the playoffs was goal number one, like just being in the playoffs. And they acknowledge they've accomplished that goal, but they do have bigger ones. I think the only thing that would be like an actual disaster is if they got like swept in the series. That might be a bit of a deflation just because they're playing the Knicks. I think it's a winnable series. And because of that, if they just flopped and it was kind of inexplicable, that would be a little bit of a letdown. But other than that, they're kind of playing with house money on some respects. Like they did what they were supposed to do. They turned the franchise around. They're now winning for the first time in 3 or 4 years. And that's for the most part. So I think there's not a ton of pressure on the team overall. I think the Trae Young narrative could shift nationally if he has a really good series. How much that matters to you is up for debate for sure. But I think if he has an awesome series and they win, you will have a hard time hearing people bash him in the way that they kind of do nationally at times. Whereas, and I guess the last thing would be Nick McMillan's status, because he's not signed. Like he's interim head coach. Everyone's assuming he's going to be the coach beyond this, including me. If I had to choose or pick, I think he'll be the coach. But he has agency. He doesn't have to come back. He might be in demand. Nick McMillan's been a good head coach for a long time. And they've kind of pushed it off to the offseason. If he, I think the Hawks are going to try to hire him. But if he wants to go somewhere else, if some other job opens, or it's just a little bit of uncertainty when a guy's not under contract. Is all I'll point out. I'm not sure it's tied to the series by any means because it shouldn't be, but just a little sprinkling in there to worry about if you're a Hawks fan, I guess.
Interesting. Love the stakes. Love the stakes of a coach not signed, and then the John Collins situation. What's the most prevalent national narrative? You kind of got into it with Trae Young a little bit. The thing about it, his defense and lots of different things. Him, and John Collins being not necessarily on the best terms. What's the most prevalent national narrative you've heard about the Hawks that is wrong, misunderstood, or is something you heard that you're like, wait, hold on, that's not even true at all?
It's probably has to do with Trey, just because honestly, for the most part, the Hawks aren't discussed a whole lot nationally, unless it's about Trey, at least for the most part this year. And I think some of it is true. It's like one of those narratives that's couched in truth, but not also discussed with a lot of nuance. Like Trae Young is a bad defender. We all kind of know that. I don't think he's as bad as people think he is, number one. And also, there's a level of destruction that you just can't reach as a point guard defender. Like you just can't be as bad as people think he is. He's not the worst defender in the league. Like he might be positionally if you want to get granular, but like Enes Kanter is more damaging to a defense than Trae Young is. There's like no doubt about that in my mind. So there's that stuff. And also that he's not a winner. That's a big thing too. Like the Hawks have been good when he plays for the last 2 seasons. And that's last year, they were still good when he played and they were bad as a team. It's kind of not been his fault. It's kind of the easiest, simplest way to put this is that when the Hawks struggle, it's usually not because of Trae. And he drives a lot of offense for them. And I think the Hawks are just better than people think they were this season. They kind of flew under the radar. And when you start 14-20, that's going to happen. Things crystallize for you and you struggle early on. And they got hot and they got acknowledged, but they were never healthy. There was a lot of like, oh, the Hawks got healthier. I'm like, well, they kind of did, but they honestly kind of didn't. They were pretty banged up all season long. So that's one team narrative, one individual narrative. But I'm not a Trae stan like many Hawks fans would be, but I think he's definitely underrated right now.
One last curveball I'm going to throw at you that I didn't tell you beforehand. I'm asking some of the teams that don't get talked about as much nationally. Is there a narrative about this team or something like a story about this team you wish would be covered more? Is there a player specifically that is really taking a leap this year? Bogdanovich kind of comes to mind for me as a guy that's been really good that people just don't really talk about.
Yeah, he's one for sure. Like his breakout the last 2 months or so has been kind of ridiculous. He's become this like not necessarily number 1 option, but a genuine number 2 offensive option. He's been shooting the lights out. The other one that I mentioned is Clint Capela. He's getting a little bit more attention down the stretch. You know, Zach Lowe writes about you. People start to notice. That's what happens. But Clint Capela has been awesome. I think he's a top 5 defensive player of the year candidate this year. I might even go higher than that. And I'm not sure if you just polled a casual NBA fan or even a semi-diehard NBA fan, you wouldn't know that because of the Hawks numbers. And once you look at his individual impact, you wouldn't see that. So those guys are both, I think, good answers. And my sleeper would be Kevin Huerter being good. Yeah. I think Kevin Huerter's thought of as this like, white shooter basically. And he's a lot more than that. Like he's a very, very, very competent, good, role player for sure, but a guy who has higher upside than that. He's 21 years old or 22 years old. And those 3 guys I think are all under discussed right now.
A lot of talent, a lot of possibilities for this Atlanta Hawks team. Brad Rowland of Locked On Hawks. Go listen to Locked On Hawks and we'll see what happens with them and the Knicks.